Colonel Theodore Prentice convulsed violently for the last time upon his French four-poster bed, vomiting dark blood that stained the fine Belgian linen sheets. His wide eyes fixed for a moment on the face of his wife, Annabel Lee, who watched impassively beside the handmaiden, Sarah. A final understanding crossed the dying aristocrat's gaze. He had been poisoned by the two women he had most despised in life. His hands clawed desperately at the air, trying to reach the silver bell that would summon help, but his muscles no longer obeyed the commands of his poisoned brain. With a guttural rattle that echoed off the walls of the luxurious bedroom, the 51-year-old man who had ruled with an iron fist one of the largest cotton plantations in the Mississippi Delta fell lifeless. It was 2 o'clock in the morning on the 14th of June, 1851, at the Fairview Plantation, near Natchez. Annabel and Sarah had finally freed themselves from their tormentor, but the price of that freedom was only beginning to be exacted. But to understand how an aristocratic mistress and an African slave came to the point of coldly murdering one of the most powerful men in the state of Mississippi, it is necessary to return 2 years in time when their destinies intertwined in an unexpected way. Annabel Lee Walker was descended from a traditional Virginia family enriched by the tobacco trade and later by cotton. The only daughter of Judge Augustus Walker, she had received a refined education uncommon for the era, studying with private French tutors who taught her literature, music, and painting. At 26, she was promised in marriage to Colonel Theodore Prentice, a 51-year-old widower who controlled one of the largest cotton plantations in the Delta, with more than 650 slaves working lands that stretched for endless miles. The marriage arranged between the families in April of 1849 never knew genuine happiness. Theodore, a rustic and brutal man despite his title, saw in his young wife only an instrument for producing heirs who would consolidate his dynasty. From the first wedding night, Annabel experienced a cruelty that would deeply scar her soul. The colonel forced her with an animalistic violence, completely ignoring her protests and tears. When she tried to resist, he would beat her methodically, always in places where the marks could be hidden by her clothes. The bruises on her arms, back, and thighs became the mistress's constant companions, silent testimonies to the private hell she lived behind the luxurious walls of the big house. The 3 pregnancies that followed ended in miscarriages, brought on by the beatings Theodore continued to inflict, even when he knew his wife carried a child in her womb. The loss of the 3rd baby, in November of 1850, left Annabel prostrate for weeks, plunged into a deep melancholy that bordered on madness. It was during this period of recovery that Sarah definitively entered her life, forever changing the course of both their destinies. Sarah had arrived at Fairview Plantation in August of 1850, part of a lot of captives purchased by the colonel during an auction at the port of New Orleans. Descended from a fond lineage of the old kingdom of Dahomey, she possessed a singular beauty that combined delicate African features with a natural aristocratic bearing. Her skin was the color of polished ebony, her almond-shaped eyes radiated a sharp intelligence, and her graceful movements suggested an education prior to captivity that intrigued everyone on the plantation. Unlike the other newly arrived slaves, Sarah quickly demonstrated skills that transcended manual labor in the cotton fields. She could read and write in English, a rare knowledge she had acquired clandestinely while serving in an urban residence before being sold. She mastered traditional African healing techniques, using herbs and unguents to treat wounds with surprising effectiveness. She also knew of poisonous plants and their lethal properties, an ancestral wisdom passed down from her grandmother, a healer. These qualities caught the attention of the lady of the house, who was desperately seeking someone trustworthy to care for her physical and emotional wounds without asking inconvenient questions. The choice of Sarah as her personal handmaiden was a decision Annabel made against her husband's will, as he preferred to keep his wife isolated and watched over by older, less perceptive servants. But the mistress, using a rare display of stubbornness that surprised Theodore himself, insisted that only that young slave had hands delicate enough to care for her weakened health. The colonel, busy with business involving the expansion of his fields and the purchase of new captives, yielded temporarily, imagining he could reverse the decision when he deemed it convenient. It was a fatal mistake that would seal his tragic fate. The first months of the relationship between Annabel and Sarah followed the conventional patterns of mistress and servant. The handmaiden would wake the mistress at 6 o'clock, prepare warm baths with rose petals cultivated in the gardens, carefully comb her long blonde hair, and help her choose dresses appropriate for each occasion. During these intimate routines, Sarah discovered the full extent of the violence her mistress suffered. The purple and yellowed bruises covering her arms and back, the finger marks on her neck where Theodore had partially strangled her during a fit of rage, the possibly fractured ribs that caused sharp pain with every deep breath. The compassion Sarah felt transcended the barriers of class and race. She began to apply poultices of healing herbs, gently massaging the bruised areas while murmuring words of comfort in an African tongue that Annabel did not understand, but which brought a strange sense of peace. For the first time since her marriage, the mistress experienced a gentle touch, hands that healed instead of hurt, a presence that offered tenderness instead of brutality. The tears began to flow freely during these sessions of care, releasing emotions pent up by months of silent suffering. It was during one of these mornings, while Sarah was treating a particularly severe wound on Annabel's back, that the mistress whispered a confession that would change everything. "He beats me almost every night. He says I'm defective, that I can't give him heirs because I am weak and useless. He says he should send me away and find a younger, more fertile wife." The choked voice revealed an accumulated despair, an urgent need to finally share the truth with someone who might understand. Sarah, momentarily forgetting all the social hierarchies that should maintain a respectful distance, impulsively embraced her mistress, offering a physical solace that no words could express. The embrace lingered beyond what was proper, transforming into a moment of deep connection that both recognized as a point of no return. Annabel clung to her handmaiden as a drowning woman clings to a life raft, sobbing convulsively while Sarah caressed her hair and whispered promises of protection that both knew were impossible to keep. When they finally separated, something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer mistress and slave, but two women united by a mutual understanding of suffering and a desperate need for genuine affection. The relationship evolved gradually over the following months. It began with long conversations during the medical care sessions, where Annabel discovered that Sarah possessed a brilliant intelligence and fascinating perspectives on a world the mistress had never considered. The slave spoke of her childhood in Africa, the daughter of a respected healer who had taught her the secrets of medicinal plants and ancestral rituals. She described a life before slavery, where women of her lineage held positions of spiritual power, serving as intermediaries between the visible world and the realm of the ancestors. These stories transported Annabel to an alternative reality where women could be strong, independent, and respected. But Sarah also shared darker knowledge. She spoke of plants that caused deep sleep, others that provoked violent vomiting and diarrhea, and a few rare ones that led to a slow and painful death. Her grandmother, besides being a healer, had also been a connoisseur of poisons used in tribal justice rituals, when powerful men abused their positions and needed to be eliminated for the protection of the community. This ancestral knowledge, passed down orally through generations, included precise recipes for dosages and methods of administration that left few traces detectable by the doctors of the time. In return, Annabel shared her own frustrated dreams. She spoke of her passion for literature, which her husband considered improper for a married woman, confiscating books he deemed subversive. She revealed a talent for painting that she could never fully develop because Theodore ridiculed her artistic attempts. She confided her longing to see the world beyond the suffocating confines of the plantation, to travel to Europe, visit museums and theaters, and live experiences that would enrich her existence beyond the role of a decorative wife and a failed breeder. The displays of physical affection became more frequent and bold, touches that lingered during the morning hair combing, hands that met accidentally while folding clothes, hugs that were repeated whenever Annabel returned from a particularly brutal encounter with her husband. It was on a night in January of 1851, after Theodore had beaten her with particular savagery for having spilled wine on his new coat, that the relationship definitively transcended into forbidden territory. Sarah, working silently to clean the wounds on Annabel's swollen face, leaned in impulsively and gently kissed the mistress's split lip. The kiss was soft, almost maternal, offering a comfort that no medicine could provide. Annabel, instead of recoiling in horror as social conventions demanded, responded to the kiss with desperate intensity, clutching Sarah as if the handmaiden were the only solid thing in a world that was crumbling around her. The two women kissed for a long time, tasting a mixture of tears and blood that sealed a silent pact of forbidden love and shared resistance. The romance that blossomed thereafter was intense and desperate, fueled by the constant awareness of the danger they were in. During Theodore's absences, as he frequently traveled to New Orleans to handle political and commercial affairs, Annabelle and Sarah stole precious moments of intimacy. They would lock themselves in the mistress's chambers, where they could finally express their feelings without fear of immediate discovery. They made love with a tenderness that contrasted brutally with the violence Annabelle experienced in her husband's arms. They talked for hours about an impossible future where they could live freely, without the shackles of slavery and a forced marriage. One of those April afternoons, while Theodore was negotiating the purchase of new slaves in New Orleans, Annabelle asked Sarah to teach her how to braid her hair in the African style. Seated in the room illuminated by the golden light of late afternoon, the mistress positioned herself on the floor while Sarah, sitting on the bed, delicately worked her blonde hair. The handmaiden's skilled fingers moved with ancestral precision, creating thin, elaborate braids that contrasted strangely with the aristocrat's fair skin. "In my village," Sarah whispered with a nostalgic voice, "only married women could wear this type of braid. It signified an eternal commitment between two souls." Annabelle turned abruptly, her green eyes shining with tears. "Then style my hair this way. I want to carry a visible mark of our commitment, even if no one else understands its meaning." When Sarah finished, they both contemplated the reflection in the Venetian mirror. There stood a southern belle with her hair braided like an African wife, a perfect symbol of the impossible transgression they had built together. But not all moments were of tenderness. One night in May, Theodore returned unexpectedly drunk from a dinner at a neighboring plantation. He stormed into Annabelle's chambers demanding his marital rights with renewed brutality. Sarah, sleeping in the small adjacent room reserved for personal maids, awoke to the muffled screams of her beloved. She peeked through the crack of the door and saw Theodore slapping Annabelle repeatedly while tearing her nightgown. The slave felt a murderous hatred grow in her chest, but she knew that any intervention would result in her immediate death. She had to remain motionless, listening to the sounds of violence and suffering, biting her own arm until it bled to prevent herself from screaming in despair. When Theodore finally staggered out, Sarah ran to Annabelle and found her bleeding and semi-conscious on the floor. As she cleaned the wounds with trembling hands, she silently swore to her ancestors that that man would pay with his own life for the pain he inflicted. It was on that night, holding the wounded mistress in her arms, that the plan for murder began to form in her mind. But the secret could not be kept indefinitely on a plantation where hundreds of eyes watched every movement of the big house. Rumors began to circulate among the house slaves about the excessive closeness between the mistress and her handmaiden. Whispered comments about doors locked for suspicious periods, about strange sounds emanating from the master's chambers in the middle of the night, about looks exchanged between the two women that transcended the conventional relationship between mistress and servant. The situation worsened dramatically when Theodore, returning unexpectedly from a trip to New Orleans in March of 1851, surprised the two women in a compromising embrace in the plantation gardens. They thought they were alone in that secluded corner, protected by flowering vines that blocked the view from other angles. But the colonel, arriving in a new carriage he had acquired specifically to surprise his wife in potential infidelities, witnessed a passionate kiss that left no room for innocent interpretations. The explosion of fury that followed was monumental. Theodore dragged Annabelle by her hair to the big house while bellowing obscenities that made the slaves cringe in fear. He ordered Sarah to be tied to the whipping post in the central yard, where she would be publicly punished as an example to anyone who dared to contaminate the purity of the white mistress. The handmaiden received 50 lashes that tore her skin into bloody strips, while Annabelle, forced to watch from the window of her chambers, screamed hysterically, begging her husband to transfer the punishment to her. But Sarah's ordeal was merely a prelude to the even greater violence Theodore reserved for his adulterous wife. That night, he locked Annabelle in the bedroom and beat her with a brutality that surpassed all previous episodes. He broke 3 of her ribs, dislocated her left shoulder, and repeatedly kicked her belly while roaring accusations of depravity and perversion. He promised he would sell Sarah to a distant plantation where she would be used as a prostitute in a third-rate brothel, a fate considered worse than death for any captive. As for Annabelle, he swore he would lock her in one of the rooms in the slave quarters, where she would be forced to serve the overseers as punishment for her betrayal. It was this specific threat that crystallized a desperate decision in Annabelle's mind. As she lay on the floor of her room, spitting blood and broken teeth, she understood with absolute clarity that there were only two options. She could submit passively, watching Sarah be destroyed and likely being killed herself in her husband's next fit of rage, or she could act, eliminating the source of terror that controlled both their lives with an iron fist. The choice, when finally formulated in her mind broken by pain, seemed as inevitable as the sunrise. In the days that followed that horrible night, Annabelle and Sarah communicated through codes developed over months of intimate coexistence. Meaningful glances exchanged during meals, subtle gestures that went unnoticed by casual observers, tiny notes hidden in places only they knew. Slowly, methodically, they developed a plan that would require patience and absolute precision. The murder needed to look like a natural death, something that would not raise suspicions among doctors or local authorities. Sarah proposed using the poison her grandmother had taught her to prepare, extracted from the root of water hemlock, mixed with crushed castor beans and the dried leaves of pokeweed. The specific combination of these plants, when administered in small doses over several days, caused symptoms that perfectly mimicked a common illness among planters of the era, a malignant fever accompanied by internal hemorrhages. The doctors, accustomed to diagnosing these tropical ailments, would hardly suspect deliberate poisoning. The plan required Sarah to have access to Theodore's food and drink, which would not be difficult considering she often served the meals in the big house. They would start with minimal doses that would cause only mild indisposition, gradually increasing the amount to simulate the natural progression of a serious illness. Death, when it finally came, would seem the inevitable consequence of an ailment that had struck the colonel despite the best medical care available. The execution of the plan began in the second week of May 1851. Sarah carefully prepared the first dose of the poison, grinding the roots and seeds into a fine powder that she dissolved in the port wine. Theodore drank religiously after dinner. The mistress, present during the meal, forced herself to maintain a neutral expression as she watched her husband consume the poisoned drink, savoring each sip with the unconscious pleasure of one who does not imagine he is ingesting his own death. The first attempt at poisoning almost failed spectacularly. The morning after the initial dose, Theodore woke with a slight malaise and, suspicious by nature, immediately called the plantation's official taster, a slave named Moses, whose specific function was to test all food and drink before the master consumed it. Annabelle and Sarah watched in horror as the colonel ordered Moses to drink from the same wine he had consumed the night before. The slave, a 5-year-old man who had served faithfully for decades, raised the glass to his lips with trembling hands. Sarah felt a wave of nausea as she realized an innocent man would pay for her plan of revenge. But Moses, after drinking a generous amount of the poisoned wine, showed no immediate symptoms. The slow-acting poison needed hours to manifest its first signs, and the taster was dismissed before any effect became visible. Theodore, satisfied with the test, attributed his indisposition to a heavy meal and returned to his normal routine. That night, Sarah found Moses writhing in pain in the back of the slave quarters. The man was vomiting blood, his eyes pleading for help she could not offer without revealing everything. "Forgive me," she whispered in her African tongue, holding the dying man's hand as he drew his last breath. It was the first of 2 murders that would weigh eternally on her conscience. Annabelle, upon learning of Moses's death, wept copiously, questioning whether it was worth continuing with a plan that had already cost an innocent life. But Sarah, hardened by the need for survival, argued with brutal logic that to retreat now would be to waste Moses's sacrifice. They had to finish what they had started. The initial effects were subtle. Theodore complained of a slight stomachache the next morning, attributing the discomfort to the pork he had eaten for dinner. In the following days, the doses were gradually increased and the symptoms intensified. The colonel began to suffer episodes of nausea, increasingly intense abdominal pains, and a progressive weakness that left him prostrated for hours. He sent for Dr. Elias Vance, the family physician who attended the aristocracy of the Mississippi Delta. The doctor, a 55-year-old man educated at the University of Pennsylvania, carefully examined the patient and diagnosed a malignant fever, a common disease in the region that had already claimed the lives of several prominent planters. He prescribed regular bloodletting, the application of leeches, and absolute rest conventional treatments that would do nothing to halt the progression of the poisoning. Annabelle and Sarah heard the diagnosis with ill-disguised relief, aware that the doctor had inadvertently provided the perfect cover for their crime. For 2 weeks, they maintained the methodical administration of the poison. Sarah mixed the doses in his wine, in his chicken broth, even in the water. Theodore drank to relieve the thirst caused by his rising fever. The colonel was visibly wasting away, losing weight rapidly, his skin acquiring the yellowish tone characteristic of liver failure. The plantation workers commented in whispers about the severity of the illness that had struck their master, speculating whether he would survive. On the 10th day of the progressive poisoning, an incident occurred that almost revealed the entire plan. Reverend Shaw, the local parish pastor, came to administer last rites to the dying colonel. The clergyman, a 62-year-old man known for his perceptiveness, observed Theodore carefully and then turned to Annabelle with a strange expression. "Mistress Prentice, forgive my frankness, but I have seen many cases of malignant fever in my years of ministry. Your husband's symptoms seem different. There is something in his eyes, a certain yellowing, that reminds me of a poisoning case I witnessed years ago in Charleston." Annabelle's heart nearly stopped. Her hands grew cold, and she felt a cold sweat run down her back. But it was Sarah who saved the situation with impressive quickness. "Reverend," the handmaiden interrupted with calculated humility. "With all due respect," Dr. Vance explained, "that this fever can show itself in many ways. My grandmother in Africa used to say that each person responds differently to sickness, just as each tree gives fruit of a different size." The simple metaphor, delivered by a seemingly uneducated slave, distracted the pastor from his dangerous line of reasoning. The clergyman nodded condescendingly, attributing his suspicions to the overactive imagination of an old man. He administered the last sacraments and departed, never knowing how close he had been to uncovering a perfect murder. When he left, Annabelle collapsed, trembling uncontrollably. "He almost found us out. We have to stop now." But Sarah held her face firmly. "We cannot stop. Theodore is too weak to survive, but too strong to forgive us if he recovers. It is all or nothing now." Annabelle played the role of the devoted wife perfectly, sitting by her husband's bedside for hours, holding his hand with false tenderness while she patiently awaited his death. Internally, every minute beside the man who had tortured her for years was an additional torment, but she knew she had to maintain appearances to avoid any future suspicion. Sarah moved silently about the room, applying cold compresses to the colonel's feverish brow, offering him liquids that contained ever larger doses of the deadly poison. On the night of June 13th, Theodore entered a critical phase. His body began to convulse violently. He vomited dark blood that stained the white sheets. His eyes rolled back, showing only the whites. Dr. Vance was urgently summoned, but declared there was nothing more to be done but pray for the sick man's soul. The colonel was dying, and no known medicine could save him. It was then, in the early hours of June 14th, that Theodore experienced a brief moment of lucidity before death. His eyes fixed on Annabelle's face, who watched beside Sarah, and something in the two women's expressions revealed a terrible truth. He understood, in that final instant, that he was not dying of a natural disease, but had been murdered by the two people he had most despised. He tried to scream, to call for help, but his throat produced only unintelligible gurgles. His hands clawed desperately at the air, but his poisoned muscles no longer responded. Annabelle leaned over her dying husband and whispered words that only he could hear. "This is for every beating, for every baby you killed inside me, for every night of terror. Die knowing that it was we who destroyed you." Theodore tried one last time to reach the bell, but Sarah held his hand firmly, preventing any movement. With one final rattle, the colonel of Fairview Plantation passed away, his eyes eternally fixed in an expression of horror and final understanding. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Annabelle and Sarah remained motionless for long minutes, absorbing the reality of what they had done. Then, slowly, they embraced, their tears mingling as they wept not for the tyrant's death, but for the weight of the secret they would carry forever. They were free, but that freedom had been bought with blood and poison, and both knew they could never reveal the truth about that night. When they finally separated, Annabelle opened the bedroom door and walked calmly to wake the butler. "William, my husband has passed. Send for doctor. Vance immediately and prepare the house for mourning." Her voice was firm, controlled, revealing none of the storm of emotions raging within her. Sarah, remaining discreetly in the room, began to arrange the colonel's body, closing his eyes still wide with horror and crossing his hands over his chest. As the big house awoke with the news of the master's death, the two women exchanged a final look that sealed an eternal pact of silence. They had committed the perfect murder, but their trials were just beginning. They would have to face investigations, suspicions, and the constant judgment of a society that would never forgive two crimes: the forbidden love between women of different races and the death of a powerful man at the hands of those who were supposed to serve him. The funeral of Colonel Theodore Prentice was the most important social event Natchez had witnessed in years. Aristocrats from all over the Mississippi Delta converged on Fairview Plantation, their luxurious carriages forming an endless procession that stretched for miles. The body, hastily embalmed by Dr. Vance, rested in an imported mahogany coffin, adorned with solid silver hardware that reflected the light of the hundreds of candles lit around it. Annabelle, dressed in black from head to toe, received condolences with a dignity impressive for a widow of only 28. No one suspected that behind the crepe veil that hid her face, she was struggling to control not tears of sorrow, but smiles of relief for the liberation she had finally won. Sarah moved silently among the mourners, serving coffee and liqueurs with the discreet efficiency that characterized well-trained housemaids. Her eyes, however, never strayed for long from Annabelle, constantly watching for any sign of weakness that might compromise the carefully constructed charade. The tension between the two women was palpable to anyone who knew how to read subtle signs, but the aristocrats present were too busy with gossip and speculation about the plantation's future to notice the silent communication that passed between the mistress and her servant. It was during the wake that the first real threat to their safety emerged. Captain Robert Faulkner, an officer in the local militia and a distant cousin of Theodore, approached Annabelle with a grave expression that contrasted with the formal condolences of the other visitors. The 43-year-old man, known for his sharp intelligence and natural suspicion, had served in the Mexican-American War and had developed a keen instinct for detecting lies and inconsistencies. "Mistress Prentice," he said in a low voice that only Annabelle could hear, "I deeply regret your loss. Theodore was a strong man, healthy for his age. This sudden illness seemed strangely convenient for someone." Annabelle's blood ran cold. She forced herself to maintain her composure as she replied with a calculatedly trembling voice, "Captain, I do not understand what you are insinuating. My husband was ill for weeks." "Doctor, Vance can confirm the diagnosis of malignant fever that afflicted him." The officer leaned closer, his gray eyes piercing the black veil like sharp blades. "Yes, a malignant fever. Very convenient, especially considering the rumors that circulate about certain improper relationships on this property. Rumors involving you and a certain dark-skinned handmaiden." Annabelle felt the world spin around her. Someone had talked. Someone had suspected and spread rumors that now threatened to destroy everything. Her mind raced desperately, searching for a response that would neutralize the veiled accusation, but it was again Sarah who saved the critical situation. The handmaiden, appearing from nowhere with a crystal tray, strategically stumbled, spilling red wine all over the captain's impeccable military coat. "Oh, sir, 1,000 pardons," she exclaimed with exaggerated horror, immediately kneeling to try to clean the mess with her apron. "I am so clumsy. I deserve to be whipped for such incompetence." The incident broke the momentary tension and diverted the captain's attention from his dangerous accusations. Other visitors rushed over, offering handkerchiefs and assistance, turning a potentially disastrous moment into a mere domestic inconvenience. Robert Faulkner, though clearly irritated, could not make a scene at a wake without appearing boorish and insensitive. He retired to change his clothes, but not before casting a final look at Annabel that clearly promised his investigation was only just beginning. When they buried Theodore in the family mausoleum built on the hill overlooking the cotton fields, Annabel finally allowed herself to cry, not the tears society expected from a devout widow, but tears of paralyzing fear for what was to come. If Captain Faulkner decided to investigate seriously, how long would it take for him to discover the truth? How long before the connection between the sudden death of Moses the Taster and the subsequent passing of the Colonel became too obvious to ignore? In the days that followed the funeral, life at Fairview Plantation took on a strange and uncomfortable rhythm. Annabel, as the widowed heiress of a valuable property, suddenly found herself surrounded by suitors interested in her fortune and men offering to manage the plantation in her name, all assuming that a woman could not handle such a complex enterprise. Among them was Judge Albert Harrison, a neighboring planter of 55, who did not hide his ambition to annex Fairview's lands to his own properties through a convenient marriage. Mistress Prentice, he declared during a condolence visit that lingered uncomfortably. A woman of your standing should not concern herself with the heavy matters of rural administration. Allow me to offer my experience and protection. After an appropriate period of mourning, we could discuss an arrangement that would benefit both our families. The poorly disguised marriage proposal made Annabel feel a familiar nausea. Had she escaped one tyrant only to be pushed toward another? The idea of submitting again to male control, of allowing any man to touch her body after finally winning her freedom, was unbearable. It was Sarah who articulated a daring solution that had never occurred to the mistress. During one of their secret nightly conversations, when they locked themselves in the private chambers away from prying ears, the handmaiden proposed a plan that was simultaneously brilliant and dangerously transgressive. "What if you were to become with child?" she whispered in the fragrant darkness of the room. A widow expecting her late husband's child would gain precious time, perhaps even a year, before suitors could pressure her again, and an heir would solidify your control over the plantation. Annabel immediately understood where Sarah was leading, but the audacity of the proposal left her speechless. "You suggest I pretend to be pregnant?" But eventually the lie would be exposed when no baby was born. Sarah shook her head slowly, her eyes shining in the dim light. "Not pretend. Truly become with child. I know a man in the quarters, Samuel, a young man of 22, strong and healthy. He would do anything I asked. One night would be enough to plant the seed that would save us both." The proposal was scandalous on multiple levels. A noble widow lying with a slave, bearing a mixed-race child who would be presented as the legitimate heir of the deceased colonel. If discovered, it would mean complete social ruin, possibly even criminal charges. But the more Annabel pondered it, the more the idea gained a perverse logic. A child would give her legal protection against aggressive suitors, time to consolidate her control over the property, and a justification to keep Sarah permanently by her side as a wet nurse and caretaker. The execution of this second audacious plan was carefully orchestrated. On a moonless night in August of 1851, 2 months after Theodore's death, Sarah quietly led Samuel to the mistress's chambers through a service passage that avoided the main areas of the big house. The young slave, confused but obedient, was instructed on the task he was to perform. Annabel, for whom the experience would be the ultimate test of her determination to survive, prepared herself mentally for the act that would save her future. The encounter was strictly functional, devoid of any romance or pleasure. Samuel, terrified by the impossibility of the situation but unable to refuse a direct order transmitted through Sarah, fulfilled his role quickly and was immediately led back to the quarters with strict instructions never to mention what had happened under penalty of certain death. Annabel, lying in the darkness after he left, felt simultaneously empowered for having taken control of her own destiny and sullied by the need to use a body she had promised exclusively to Sarah. The handmaiden, understanding the turmoil of emotions that tormented her beloved, lay down beside her and held her tenderly. "You did what you had to do for our survival," she whispered consolingly. "Your body is still yours, and it remains mine as well. That man was just a tool, nothing more." The words brought some comfort, but Annabel knew that the emotional scar of that night would remain forever, reminding her of the terrible price women paid to survive in a world controlled by men. 6 weeks later, when the first unequivocal signs of pregnancy manifested, Annabelle publicly announced the news that would completely change the power dynamics in the region. Dr. Vance, called to confirm the diagnosis, was genuinely surprised but suspected nothing irregular. After all, Theodore had been alive until June, and a 2-month pregnancy in August was perfectly plausible. The news spread quickly throughout the Mississippi Delta, and the suitors who had been circling the young widow respectfully withdrew, awaiting the birth of the heir who would determine Fairview's future. But not everyone celebrated the revelation. Captain Robert Faulkner, who had maintained a discreet watch over the plantation since the funeral, became deeply suspicious of the convenient timing. During an unannounced visit to the property, he confronted Annabelle with more direct accusations than before. Mistress Prentice, the timing of this pregnancy is remarkably convenient. Theodore was ill for weeks before he died. A sick man would hardly have the energy to fulfill his marital duties. Annabelle, strengthened by the real pregnancy she carried, responded with authentic indignation. "Captain, you overstep all bounds of decency by questioning the intimacies of my marriage. My late husband, even when ill, was a virile man who visited me regularly. This child is living proof of his legacy." The response was vehement enough to make the officer retreat temporarily, but Annabelle knew she had only bought precious time, not a definitive victory. It was during this tense period that an incident occurred that almost destroyed everything Annabelle and Sarah had built. Hattie, an older slave who had served for decades in the big house, began asking inconvenient questions about the mysterious disappearance of certain herbs from the pantry. The 5-8-year-old woman, experienced in the culinary and medicinal arts, had recognized that the specific plants used by Sarah in the teas and broths served to the colonel were exactly those employed in traditional African poisons. One September afternoon, Hattie confronted Sarah directly in the kitchen while the other slaves were working in the back of the property. "Girl, I saw what you did. I recognized the roots that went missing, the seeds that were ground. My grandmother in Africa used the same plants to kill the tribe's enemies." Sarah's heart pounded, but she maintained a neutral expression. "I don't know what you're talking about, old woman. I am only caring for the mistress as I was ordered." Hattie moved dangerously close, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You killed the master, and the mistress was in on it. I've seen how you two look at each other. I know sin when I see it. Perhaps Captain Faulkner would be interested in this information. Perhaps he would reward me generously for revealing the truth." The explicit blackmail froze Sarah's blood. Hattie was not seeking justice, but personal gain. She wanted money, perhaps even her freedom, in exchange for her silence about the colonel's murder. Sarah reported the confrontation immediately to Annabelle, and they both faced a devastating moral dilemma. They could pay for Hattie's silence indefinitely, becoming perpetual hostages to her greed, or they could eliminate the threat permanently, adding a third murder to their growing list of crimes. The decision they made that night would reveal just how far they were willing to go to protect their secret and their hard-won freedom. Annabelle, now 3 months pregnant and thinking of the child she carried, initially argued for a peaceful solution. "We can buy her silence, promise her manumission after my son is born. We have killed too much already." But Sarah, hardened by years of slavery and aware of the precariousness of her position, responded with brutal pragmatism. "People like Hattie are never satisfied with a single payment. She would bleed you dry, and when there was nothing left to extract, she would sell your secrets anyway. She needs to be silenced permanently." The discussion lasted through the night, both aware of the moral precipice on which they were balanced. Finally, Annabelle agreed with Sarah's terrible logic, but she imposed a condition. "If we do this, promise me it will be the last time. I cannot keep accumulating deaths on my conscience. I cannot raise my child on a plantation built upon corpses." Sarah agreed, knowing in her heart that it was a promise impossible to guarantee, in a world where every day brought new threats and dangers. The murder of Hattie was planned with the same meticulousness that had characterized the colonel's poisoning, but with an added urgency imposed by the imminent blackmail. Sarah prepared a massive dose of the same poison used against Theodore, an amount sufficient to cause a rapid death instead of a gradual decline. She mixed the lethal powder into a bottle of high-quality whiskey, a supposedly generous gift from the mistress to a veteran slave in recognition of her years of loyal service. Hattie, suspicious by nature but also greedy, accepted the gift with an initial distrust that was overcome by the exceptional quality of the liquor. That night, alone in her small cabin in the quarters, she drank generously from the poisoned whiskey, while mentally celebrating the fortune she would extort from the murderous mistress. The symptoms manifested within minutes: violent convulsions, explosive vomiting, and excruciating pain that made her scream loud enough to wake the neighboring slaves. By the time help arrived, Hattie was already dying. Her last words, stammered through foaming lips, were a partial accusation that no one fully understood. The mistress, the handmaiden, they killed. But before she could complete the revelation that would destroy Annabelle and Sarah, a final convulsion stole her life. The other slaves, accustomed to sudden deaths in the harshness of captive life, attributed her passing to natural causes or perhaps witchcraft, never suspecting they had witnessed a coldly calculated murder. Dr. Vance, called to examine the body, determined that Hattie had died of accidental poisoning, likely from ingesting spoiled food or a toxic plant consumed by mistake. No one associated the death of an old slave with the pregnant, grieving mistress who lived in seclusion in appropriate mourning. The perfect crime had been committed again, but the psychological price it exacted from Annabelle was immense. That night, locked in her chambers, Annabelle broke down completely. She sobbed uncontrollably in Sarah's arms, repeating between tears, "We are monsters. We have killed 3 people. How can I bring an innocent child into this world stained with so much blood?" Sarah, though she also carried the weight of the crimes committed, remained strong for them both. "We are not monsters. We are survivors. Each person who died was a threat to our existence. We had no choice." But even Sarah knew the justification sounded increasingly hollow. They had crossed so many moral lines that they no longer recognized their own reflections in the mirror. The love that had united them had transformed into a chain that bound them to an endless cycle of violence and secrecy. And the child growing in Annabelle's womb would be the heir not only to a considerable fortune, but also to a dark legacy of crimes his mothers had committed to ensure his survival. The months following Hattie's murder were marked by a growing paranoia that turned Fairview Plantation into a luxurious prison for its 2 most important inhabitants. Annabelle, her belly growing visibly, rarely left her chambers, claiming the weakness typical of pregnancy. In truth, she feared that every glance directed at her contained suspicion, that every whispered conversation among the slaves was discussing her secret guilt. Sarah, now officially promoted to housekeeper of the big house, rigidly controlled who had access to the mistress, creating a protective isolation that also served to limit witnesses to any slip-up that might reveal the truth. It was in November of 1851, as Annabelle entered her 7th month of gestation, that the final crisis began to materialize. Captain Robert Faulkner, whose suspicion had never been fully appeased, returned to the plantation, accompanied by an unexpected figure: Dr. Augustus Finch, a medical examiner from New Orleans, a specialist in the detection of poisonings and other sophisticated crimes. The 47-year-old man, a graduate of the University of Edinburgh and author of a pioneering treatise on forensic toxicology, had come to investigate a series of suspicious deaths that were beginning to form a worrying pattern in the eyes of the authorities. "Mistress Prentice," the captain announced with cold formality during a visit. Annabelle could not refuse without raising additional suspicion. "Dr. Finch is conducting an investigation into several recent deaths in the region, cases of malignant fever that present unusual characteristics. Naturally, your late husband's passing is being reviewed as part of this comprehensive study." Annabelle's blood ran cold, but years of aristocratic education allowed her to maintain a flawless external composure even as absolute panic raged within. The medical examiner, a meticulous man with round glasses and a notebook always at hand, began to ask questions that demonstrated an alarming understanding of forensic medicine. "Mistress Prentice, could you describe in detail the progression of your late husband's symptoms? Specifically, was there a yellowing of the skin, unusual bleeding, changes in body odor?" Each question was a potential trap, as answers that were too precise would suggest a suspicious knowledge of poisoning, while vague answers would seem evasive and guilty. Annabelle navigated the interrogation with extreme care, offering descriptions detailed enough to seem like a genuine witness, but avoiding a specificity that could reveal an intimate knowledge of toxicology. Sarah, serving tea and biscuits during the visit, listened to every word with total attention, prepared to intervene if Annabel began to sink into dangerous contradictions. The tension in the parlor was palpable, each second dragging on like an eternity as the doctor meticulously noted every response. It was then that Dr. Finch asked a question that completely changed the dynamic of the investigation. "Mistress Prentice, I understand that 2 other individuals on this property have died in similar circumstances in recent months. The taster, Moses, and the slave, Hattie. Both presented symptoms consistent with poisoning by specific plant compounds found in certain African medicinal traditions." The silence that followed was deafening. The examiner had just connected 3 seemingly unrelated deaths by a common thread that pointed directly to a specific methodology rarely employed in the South. Sarah, recognizing that the situation had become critical beyond any hope of dissimulation, made a desperate decision that would save Annabel but condemn herself. She knelt dramatically at the doctor's feet, assuming an expression of absolute terror that was not entirely feigned. "Doctor, Captain, I must confess, it was me. I killed Master Prentice." The shocking declaration paralyzed everyone present. Annabel let out a genuine cry of horror, instantly understanding the sacrifice her beloved was making. "Sarah, no," the mistress exclaimed, but the handmaiden continued her confession with unshakable determination. "The master forced himself on me constantly, used my body whenever he pleased. I was tired of the abuse, so I used the knowledge my grandmother taught me in Africa. I mixed poisons in his food for weeks until he died. The mistress knew nothing. She is innocent." The tears streaming down Sarah's face were absolutely real, born not of remorse for the crime, but of the certainty that she would never see Annabel again, never hold the child growing in her beloved's womb. Captain Faulkner and Dr. Finch exchanged significant glances. The confession fit perfectly into a narrative that the authorities could accept: a sexually abused slave poisoning her cruel master. It was a tragic but understandable story within the brutal logic of slave society. But both men, experienced in human nature and crime, perceived elements that did not align perfectly with the confession. The obvious devotion between the mistress and the handmaiden, the convenient timing of the pregnancy, the death of Hattie, which Sarah had not mentioned. "And what of Moses and Hattie?" pressed Dr. Finch, testing the consistency of the confession. Sarah hesitated for only a fraction of a second before answering. "Moses was an accident. He tasted the poisoned wine before I could stop him. Hattie discovered what I had done and tried to blackmail me, so I killed her too, to protect my secret." The admission of 3 murders sealed her fate completely, but it also provided a coherent narrative that exonerated Annabel of any guilt. Annabel, understanding the supreme sacrifice Sarah was making, fought desperately to save the woman she loved. "It can't be true. Sarah has always been loyal, gentle. If my husband abused her, I should have protected her. The fault is mine for not seeing her suffering." But Captain Faulkner, though he may have suspected the full story was more complex, now had a detailed confession of serious crimes. Legally, the case was closed. A slave had confessed to the murder of a white master, a capital crime that demanded the maximum punishment. "Mistress Prentice," he said with a tone that mixed official formality and genuine compassion, "I understand your shock, but the law is clear. This slave has confessed to capital crimes and must be judged accordingly. She will be transported immediately to the jail in Natchez, where she will await a formal trial." Soldiers who had been waiting outside entered and grabbed Sarah by the arms. The handmaiden did not resist, but her eyes sought Annabel's face one last time, communicating eternal love and a final farewell. The 2 women exchanged a look that contained a universe of meanings impossible to express in words. Broken promises of a future together, memories of stolen nights of passion, a shared recognition that Sarah's sacrifice was the only way to save at least one of them. "I love you." Annabel's lips moved silently. "And I will always love you," Sarah replied in the same way, before being dragged out of the big house, leaving the pregnant mistress collapsing in tears on the Persian rug, stained with the memories of all they had shared. The trial of Sarah was swift and brutal, as were all proceedings involving slaves accused of crimes against white masters. 3 weeks after her arrest, in December of 1851, She was brought before a makeshift court in the Natchez City Hall. The judge, Judge Franklin Davies, a 63-year-old man known for his implacable severity in matters involving social order, listened to Sarah's confession with an expression of growing disgust. There were no defenders, no defense witnesses, no presentation of mitigating circumstances. Sarah, standing in the center of the room illuminated by the cold December light, repeated the confession that had saved Annabelle, but condemned herself. She admitted to the poisoning of Colonel Prentice, the accidental death of Moses, and the premeditated murder of Hattie. She omitted only Annabelle's involvement and the nature of the loving relationship that had bound them, protecting until the end the secrets that could not be revealed. The sentence was pronounced in less than an hour of deliberation. Sarah would be publicly executed by hanging in the main square of Natchez, as an example to other slaves who might consider raising a hand against their masters. The execution was scheduled for the 7th of January, 1852, allowing enough time for planters from all over the region to be summoned to witness the spectacle that would reaffirm the racial and social hierarchies of the South. Annabelle, upon receiving news of the sentence, went into premature labor caused by the extreme emotional stress. Her son, a boy with surprisingly fair skin that did not reveal Samuel's African ancestry, was born in the early morning of December 23rd, weighing only 5 pounds but alive and healthy. The mistress held the baby in her arms and wept, tears that mixed joy for the new life and despair for the life that would be taken in a few weeks. She named the boy Theodore Augustus, in official homage to the late colonel, but she whispered to him a secret name that only she and Sarah would know: Hope, symbolizing the better future they had dreamed of together but would never live. The baby became the anchor that held Annabelle to life when everything inside her wanted to give up and die along with Sarah. She had a responsibility now, a son to raise, a legacy to protect, even if every breath was torture without the woman she loved. In the days leading up to the execution, Annabelle tried desperately to use her influence and fortune to save Sarah. She offered astronomical bribes to the judge, appealed to influential pastors, and wrote pleading letters to state authorities in Jackson. But no amount of money or influence could reverse a death sentence against a slave who had confessed to the murder of a white master. The most she could obtain was permission to visit Sarah one last time in the filthy jail where she awaited execution. The final meeting between the two women took place on the 5th of January, 1852, in a fetid cell lit only by a solitary candle. Annabelle carried the baby Theodore in her arms, wanting Sarah to meet the child she had indirectly helped to conceive. The handmaiden, drastically emaciated after weeks of captivity and psychological torture, smiled through tears upon seeing the boy. "He is beautiful," she whispered in a hoarse voice. "He has your eyes, your strong spirit. Raise him well, teach him to be kind, unlike all the men we have known." Annabelle sat on the filthy floor of the cell, not caring about the dirt staining her silk dress. She held Sarah's hand and simply remained that way, in silence, sharing the last precious moments before the final separation. There were no longer enough words to express all they felt, all the accumulated love, all the pain of the imminent farewell. After a long time, Sarah broke the silence. "Do not forget me. Tell him stories about me when he grows up. Not about the crimes, but about the love we shared. Promise me our story will not be completely lost." Annabelle promised through tears that fell uncontrollably. "I will never forget. You were the only true love of my life. Everything I did, all the crimes we committed, were because we loved each other too much to accept the cruelty of this world. If there is a next life, I will find you again. And this time we will live without fear, without shame, without the need to kill to protect our love." Sarah kissed Annabelle one last time, a kiss made salty by the tears of both, a kiss that contained both farewell and promise. When the guard came to announce that visiting time was over, Annabelle had to be literally dragged from the cell. Her screams echoed through the damp corridors of the prison, mingling with the cries of the frightened baby. "Don't leave me. I can't live without you. Let me die by your side." But no one answered her pleas. The law would run its course, and Sarah would face the fate she had accepted to save the woman she loved. The morning of the 7th of January 1852 dawned gray and cold, the overcast sky seeming to share in the mourning for the tragedy about to unfold. The main square of Natchez, filled with a crowd that included aristocratic planters, curious merchants, and slaves forced to witness a warning about the consequences of rebellion. In the center, a wooden gallows awaited its victim, a rope swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Sarah was led to the scaffold with a surprising dignity for someone about to die. She wore a simple white cotton dress, her hair braided in the style she had taught Annabelle months before, a symbol of the eternal commitment she would carry to her death. She refused the services of the pastor who offered last blessings, declaring that her African ancestors awaited her and that she had no need of a Christian God who allowed slavery and injustice. Annabelle, hidden in the crowd with a black veil covering her face, held the baby Theodore against her chest and forced herself to witness the execution of the woman she loved. She felt she owed it to Sarah to be present in this final moment, even if every second was unbearable agony. When the executioner placed the rope around Sarah's neck, the handmaiden searched through the crowd, and her eyes met Annabelle's one last time. She smiled, a genuine smile, as if she were seeing something beautiful instead of imminent death. The trapdoor opened with a bang that echoed across the square. Sarah's body dropped, the rope went taut, her neck broke with a dry snap that Annabelle would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. The handmaiden convulsed for a few terrible seconds, then hung still, swaying gently in the breeze like a dead leaf. Annabelle bit her own fist until it bled to keep from screaming, hugging her son with a force that almost hurt him. Around her, the crowd slowly dispersed, satisfied that justice had been served and the social order reaffirmed. But in Annabelle's secret heart, justice was far from having been served. Sarah had died for crimes they had both committed together, taking on the full weight of a shared guilt. The true criminal, the one who still lived and breathed and held an innocent baby, would remain free while the love of her life dangled from a rope in the public square. This final injustice would be a burden Annabelle would carry to her own death, a constant reminder of the terrible price paid for a forbidden love in a society incapable of understanding or accepting such a transgression. Annabelle lived for another 43 years after Sarah's execution, dying in 1895 at the age of 72. She never remarried, dedicating her entire life to raising her son Theodore and managing Fairview Plantation with an efficiency that surprised the men of the region. The boy grew up strong and healthy, never knowing the truth about his own conception or about the impossible love his mothers had shared. Annabelle kept the promise she had made in the jail, telling him stories about Sarah, presented only as a loyal and courageous handmaiden who had sacrificed her life to protect her mistress. She also kept the secrets she never revealed to a living soul, the shared crimes, the murders necessary for survival, the forbidden love that defied all social and racial conventions of her time. These secrets she took to her grave when she was finally buried next to Colonel Theodore in the family mausoleum, a final irony that placed her for eternity beside the man she had hated, while the woman she had loved lay in the unmarked grave of an executed slave. But in her will, she left a mysterious clause that intrigued all who knew her. She ordered that a substantial amount of her fortune be used to build a small chapel on the exact spot where Sarah had been hanged. The chapel, erected in 1896, bore a simple plaque that read only, "In memory of Sarah, who loved beyond the limits imposed by this world. May her soul finally find the peace and freedom denied in life." No one understood the true meaning of these words, but the few who knew the whispered history said the chapel was a monument, not to a criminal slave, but to an impossible love that had defied death and time. The story of Annabelle and Sarah remained largely forgotten for more than a century, only vague rumors preserved in the memories of the descendants of slaves who had witnessed the events of that turbulent period. It was only in 2012, when a historian researching the judicial archives of Natchez discovered the records of Sarah's trial, that the full story began to be reconstructed. Annabelle's personal letters, found later, revealed the truth she had guarded so zealously, a deep and genuine love between two women separated by race, class, and all the barriers that antebellum society could erect. Today, historians debate the complex moral legacy of this story. Were Annabelle and Sarah victims of a brutal system that offered no legitimate ways to escape abuse and oppression? Or were they criminals who crossed unforgivable moral lines by murdering 3 people to protect their secret and their freedom? The truth, as often happens in real history, lies in the uncomfortable gray area between these extremes. They were simultaneously victims and perpetrators, devoted lovers and calculating killers, products of a brutal era that demanded impossible choices from people imprisoned by circumstances beyond their control. What remains unquestionable is the extraordinary courage they showed in loving one another in a world that condemned such love as a capital sin, and the supreme sacrifice that Sarah made, offering her own life to save the woman she loved and the child she would never know. In the silent chapel built on the site of her execution, occasional visitors still leave flowers, recognizing that there lies not just a slave executed for a crime, but a martyr to a love that transcended all the barriers society tried to impose. This story ends where it began, with death and secrets, but also with the persistent memory that genuine love, even when born in the most unlikely and desperate circumstances, has the power to transform lives, defy injustice, and endure long beyond the mortal bodies that housed it. Annabelle and Sarah paid a terrible price for loving as they did, but the legacy they left continues to echo through the generations, reminding us that no human law can truly imprison or destroy a love that refuses to be silenced.